I am thrilled and honored to be joining you today. Thank you to Euromoney for the gracious invitation. My name is Lindsey Schafferer, and I am the advisory lead at RMI Center for Climate Aligned Finance. My background is actually in financial services. I'm an alumni of Goldman Sachs and S&P Global, and I'm with you today to really share perspectives on the financial sector's climate journey and to highlight the how of how financial institutions, specifically institutional investors, are beginning to align themselves with Paris climate goals by taking a proactive role in influencing the real economy towards net zero emissions. So a bit about us, the Center for Climate Aligned Finance is approaching our first birthday. We were launched in July of 2020 to serve as an engine room, a place where global financial institutions operating across the investment chain can come and tackle the practical challenges that they face to aligning investment and lending decisions with global climate goals. So it's likely not a surprise to anybody with us today that expectations of financial institutions on climate, whether that's commercial banks, investment banks, or institutional investors like asset owners or asset managers, are increasing at quite a rapid pace. These expectations are complex and they continue to evolve. And the financial sector has really been on a long journey to define its role in sustainability, ESG, and more specifically on climate action. The sector has gone through many phases, responding to societal demands and increasing shareholder expectations over time. And so just to highlight this journey, we began in a place really with do no harm, with principles like the Equator Principles, to just financing more green with blockbuster sustainable finance commitments, to an evolution of heightened risk disclosure with the introduction and adoption of TCFD in markets around the world. And just recently, we saw the G7 commit to mandated climate-related financial disclosures. And of course, the exclusion and divestment policies on high carbon assets are not really new news to anybody. We are at a pivotal moment where momentum on climate has never been higher globally, and I believe it's really important for us to take a step back and ask the question, where might all of this be headed? So even in the last 6 months alone, we've seen some of the largest US banks and asset managers commit to aligning portfolios with net zero, reactions to these increasing expectations, and a fundamental recognition that the capital markets really have a proactive role to play in our transition to a low carbon future. And this fundamental shift is illustrated in the evolution from simply thinking about ESG integration, things like climate risk management and mitigation, to a holistic, all of portfolio, all of firm approach to aligning with the Paris Climate Agreement. So if we review the context in which we're speaking today, look at how things have accelerated, and this slide does a decent job of illustrating that. We're in the midst of a transition that Larry Fink recently described as a tectonic shift in his 2021 investor relations letter. And the shift has been underway for quite some time and is certainly not yet complete. In general, we like to think of this shift in two major thrusts. The first is really a risk-based transition. That is the acknowledgement that ESG, and more specifically climate factors, can be considered financially material. And the second, which we still see playing out today, is values-based. That is that decarbonization is really a societal imperative, and that every actor in the global economy, including financial institutions, have an active role to play in getting us there. It also encompasses a recognition that of the market opportunity that exists for financial institutions. And in fact, I think it actually goes even further. It represents a fundamental recognition that the capital markets and financial institutions specifically are the lifeblood of the global real economy. And in order to make meaningful progress on decarbonization, the technological innovation required, the adoption of low carbon technologies, financial institutions can and must play a pivotal role. And while this is a really exciting revolution and a monumental one, it's one that certainly is met with distinct challenges. There are significant yet practical barriers that financial institutions face today that must be overcome in partnership with the sector, their industry clients, to move the needle at the pace required. So where does this all leave us today? We really have reached an inflection point where financial institutions face unprecedented pressure from clients, activists, shareholders, and regulators to consistently do more on climate. And financial institutions globally are actually stepping up, leveraging their influence in the markets to induce the change necessary to begin priming industries for their low carbon transition. So how do we think about the financial sector's role? What does this look like today, and how might this evolve over time? A new paradigm is taking hold that folds in the earlier trends that we just reviewed and can serve as a long-term framework for the financial sector and the low carbon transition. And that paradigm is climate alignment. So what is climate alignment? Climate alignment helps us define the role of financial institutions in the low carbon transition. We must recognize that today, the global economy is certainly not aligned with the 1.5C future, which means that climate alignment is not feasible today for diverse financial institutions. Yet, global diversified financial institutions have done studies as recent as 2019 and 2020 on multi-asset portfolios, some of which most of you have probably read, that show the need to divest their top holdings, swaths of their top holdings, in order to achieve a portfolio that might be aligned with a 1.5C future. Not feasible and certainly not impactful in today's world. Yet climate alignment operates as a framework and represents a holistic approach that can help get us where we need to go over time. And it places the real economy at the core of its framework. It's about being a part of a broader transformation and harnessing the opportunities that exist along the way, while increasing the share of low carbon assets in a portfolio and transitioning the asset base within carbon intensive sectors. So what does this concept of climate alignment actually mean for financial institutions in practice? Climate alignment means proactively pursuing climate objectives by using lending and investment decisions, things like advisory service, capital markets activities, and even efforts like stewardship and policy advocacy to move the real economy towards net zero. But why should financial institutions like institutional investors play a proactive role in influencing the real economy? So I briefly mentioned that financial institutions face barriers to systemically embedding climate at the core of their transaction activities. And these barriers are certainly significant and systemic-wide challenges. To highlight a few of these challenges that are illustrated on the slide here, for example, the data challenge, and we hear this a lot in our conversations at the center with financial institutions. The lack of verifiable quality scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions data, forward-looking emissions projections as examples. There's also a very clear first mover disadvantage. As we mentioned, divestment simply might create the opportunity for other financial institutions to soak up that similar lending or investment opportunity. However, these challenges are also met with clear opportunities. For example, first movers are very clearly shaping the landscape in which we operate today for the entire market, have the opportunity to define standards and best practices. And those financial institutions that lean in on these topics today also have the potential to harness growing market opportunity from clients who are becoming increasingly climate conscious. So if you're an institutional investor in the room with us today, one way your firm can take action is by joining an existing investor framework. And there certainly are many. A few are highlighted on this slide, and it is certainly not comprehensive. However, we must recognize that it's difficult to navigate the investor network and initiative landscape today. Answering questions like, which network should I join and when? What challenge might it help my firm solve? What challenge might it not help my firm solve? Well, the center is here to help you think through what might make sense for your firm. I want to highlight here that among all these initiatives out there to support you and your clients, there's a really important thread running through this landscape, and that thread is the concept of influence. So we can see the concept of influence embedded in a lot of the emerging frameworks for climate-aligned target setting for institutional investors, such as UNFFI's Net Zero Asset Owners Alliance Target Setting Protocol, the IAGCC's Net Zero Investment Framework, and SBTFI's Target Setting Guidance. The newly published Climate Action 100 Net Zero Company Benchmark has given investors and banks a way to begin measuring credibility of corporate transition plans in a standardized way. So all of these frameworks have a target setting and transparency component, certainly integral parts. But in addition, they also include components on activating in different investor influence levers, whether that's through your investment strategy, engagement and stewardship, product offerings, policy advocacy. And while the frameworks that I just mentioned certainly play a critical role in supporting investors on their journey to climate alignment in very different ways, outside of these core initiatives, there are certainly actions that investors can take today to start moving the needle, whether that's on product offerings, investment strategy, corporate engagement, and advocacy. And it's important to recognize what net zero means for one institutional investor might look different than another. For example, asset managers versus asset owners, investors operating in different geographic jurisdictions under different regulatory schemes. Yet we do continue to see, for example, asset managers taking bolder steps towards aligning portfolios with global climate goals, beginning with bold public commitments. We're seeing inflows to sustainable passive investment products at record pace, commitments to disclose things like temperature alignment of portfolios and interim targets. So it's fair to say that institutional investors are increasingly placing climate objectives at the heart of their investment mandates. We've seen increasing concern over the capacity to assess the credibility of corporate transition strategies and measure progress towards those strategy objectives over time. However, all of this is great news, but we cannot ignore the idea that not all portfolios are created equal. So there's a growing need to define what climate alignment might mean for different types of portfolios in the landscape, whether that be actively managed 40 Act mutual funds or passively managed vehicles like ETFs, and when it is appropriate to use a climate aligned label for a product offering or investment vehicle or investment strategy. There's also a growing need for collaboration between asset managers and their institutional clients to help shape and define how a unique investment mandate can be structured around climate objectives. And so given everything that we know today, we're brought back to the core topic of our discussion. We're at an inflection point. We're seeing the financial sector action on climate move from being a conversation about ESG and risk considerations to the financial sector really taking a proactive role on climate and contributing to decarbonization. This movement from risk began with an increasing effort towards implementation and adoption of TCFD. We now have global acceptance that climate risks are actually a threat to financial stability, and that's reflected in growing engagement by central banks and supervisors and regulators who have begun to mandate disclosure. And as I mentioned, the most recent commitment from the G7 around climate-related disclosures. And we're now at a place where FIs are increasingly recognizing the need to mobilize around decarbonization. And we've seen efforts to support them in doing so proliferate over the last several years. So today we've examined a sliver of the work underway to support institutional investors in their net zero journeys, and there's certainly more to be done. In closing, I just want to share that the core of our mission at the Center for Climate-Aligned Finance is to support institutional investors, banks, and capital markets in playing a proactive role in moving the global economy towards a net zero future. If anything I mentioned today resonated with you, if it sparked additional questions, please do not hesitate to reach out directly. We would love to continue the conversation bilaterally and look forward to continue supporting the financial markets and meeting the expectation on climate. We would love to connect and learn from you. Thank you so much for joining us today. Please now switch to the next session in the agenda and join me for a live Q&A session where I will be present to answer any questions you may have. Thank you again, and I look forward to taking your questions.